In 1908, when Frank Pick started his new job as publicity manager for the London Underground Rail Network, he wasn't overly impressed by the lacklustre assortment of posters they were using to promote the service. Although he had no previous experience in art or design, he could see that they were uninspired and resolutely Victorian. So he set about an ambitious process of transformation and modernisation of all the Underground's publicity material. His first choice for commission was John Hassell, arguably the most popular poster artist in Britain at that time. And he produced two striking humorous posters which were obviously a world apart from what had gone before. Even so, it wasn't an overnight transformation, and in the first couple of years progress was sporadic. Pick understood that humour was a generally successful way to get your poster noticed and your message across, and many of his commissions reflected this belief. One of his earliest choices was the American cartoonist Tony Sarg, who was living and working in London at this time and was yet to make a name for himself. Even so, Pick entrusted him with a series of posters using exceptionally complex crowd scenes to comically underline the variety of places and activities the tube could whisk you away to. And although not strictly humorous, the popular children's illustrator Mabel Lucy Atwell created a string of endearing, light-hearted picture book images promoting child-friendly events and destinations in and around the capital. In 1914, war was declared, but the fighting was almost entirely confined to the battlefields of France and Belgium. So other than the display of army recruitment posters, it was business as usual for the Underground. And just as the war began, the first posters by Frederick Gregory Brown appeared. They were a radical departure from anything seen previously in Britain. The series he created promoting trips to London Zoo demonstrated considerable skill and judgment in his visually compelling arrangement of flat-coloured areas. Soon after, others such as Fred Taylor began creating similar but less ambitious posterised images. Along with these inducements to travel by tube, there were also more instructional posters about how to be a considerate traveller. These were called etiquette posters, and Pick intuitively understood that cartoonists such as George Morrow and William Hazelden were more likely to get the message across than more authoritarian warnings. But humorous or not, by 1920, the trend towards modernism in all the Underground's publicity material had become virtually absolute, and it was now effectively a corporate identity. The original logo had been streamlined into a more minimal design, and it became official policy to only use the Johnson typeface, although there were still quite a few exceptions made. Expatriate American Edward McKnight Kauffer had been producing daringly modernist work for other clients since around 1915, but it was 1920 before he started getting commissions from the Underground. And his radical but aesthetically pleasing images made him one of Pick's favourites. Most of the Underground's publicity was printed by the Baynard Press, and Frederick Herrick was the head of their art studio. Like Kauffer, he had a particularly good working relationship with Frank Pick, and throughout the decade and into the next, he produced many distinctive and stylish posters. More than any other, Herrick pushed hard at the boundaries of posterised colour, with some dazzling and occasionally psychedelic results. His contemporary Dora Batty wasn't the first female illustrator to be commissioned, but she was certainly one of the most talented and popular. Her highly decorative illustrations first appeared in the early 1920s, and like Herrick, she brought a well-considered aesthetic balance to her work, much of which was aimed at the female traveller. And from 1920 onwards, the posters of Charles Payne demonstrated an equally modern sensibility, and frequently a large measure of frivolity. Like Herrick and Batty, his simple but memorable work appeared constantly throughout the 20s and into the 30s. This trio of illustrators, along with Kauffer and Brown, were undoubtedly the most popular in what was rapidly becoming an overcrowded market. But there were other lesser-known illustrators such as Charles Burton and Kathleen Stenning, who were creating equally attractive posters, if not with the same frequency. In 1925, what had to date been called Modernism was christened Art Deco, after the wildly successful decorative arts exhibition in Paris in that year. and the posters created during Frank Pick's management were widely acknowledged to have been among the very first to embrace and dictate the movement's stylistic principles. From the mid-1920s onward, many more illustrators were drawn toward the underground, and newcomers such as Austin Cooper started to appear alongside the established figures. Cooper's posters were dynamic compositions which followed the broad principles of Art Deco, but with a more frivolous style which occasionally incorporated collage. Similarly, Heather Perry, who was better known by her nickname Herry, created some whimsical posters between the late 20s and early 30s. Although her work also displayed some of the expected qualities of Art Deco, she was far from slavish in its use, and among other images she created a series of particularly engrossing illustrated maps which were popular with tube travellers. Although her female contemporaries, Kate Burrell and Alma Faulkner, didn't have the same level of success, they demonstrated a facility with the lighter application of modernist styling. And there were others who trod a different, although still modernist, path. The particularly obscure Maurice Miles came out of nowhere to produce these two memorable and atmospheric posters before vanishing without trace. Swedish-born Anne-Marie Johnson also put in a relatively brief appearance, but her playful posters for the zoo were a clear indication of her future as a children's book illustrator. Others, such as Stanislaus Longley, continued to explore the possibilities of the more cubistic aspects of Art Deco. And Alan Rogers went even further into the realms of the geometric, with his striking, almost diagrammatic images, and he too seems to have subsequently disappeared. In 1933, Frank Pick was promoted to become the chairman of the newly created London Passenger Transport Board, and inevitably this distanced him from the day-to-day process of briefing and commissioning artists. But sheer momentum and the talent of the illustrators he had brought on board kept the quality high in the years that followed. By 1935, Art Deco was losing its dominant position and had become relegated to just one of any number of modernist approaches. And it was at this time that paint, however non-representational or widely applied, came back into fashion. Betty Swanwick was among the instigators of this shift of style, and she brought a naive folk art influenced painting technique to her images and used a far looser, more anarchic approach to her compositions than previously seen. Married couple Clifford and Rosemary Ellis took joint ownership of their work for the underground. Posters created by them first appeared in the middle of the 1930s, and like Betty Swanwick, they had a visually playful, expressionistic approach to both their subjects and their application of colour. Around the same time, Anna Zinkerson created a series of undeniably modern posters which owed next to nothing to Art Deco. Her figures were highly stylised and her colouring boldly graphic, but she was manifestly not constrained by any particular art discipline. Hans Schläger, working under the alias Zero, favoured a more dynamic reductionist technique, which would soon come to be dominant in all post-war Europe. And the same approach to the use of textures and abstraction could clearly be seen in the work of the design partnership Tom Eckersley and Eric Lombers. In the later 1930s, the etiquette poster made a resounding return with the highly distinctive cartoon style of Cyril Kenneth Bird, better known as Fougas. His relentlessly imaginative comic posters were extremely popular with the public and have since become an icon of 20th century graphics. But in 1939, Britain finally declared war on Germany, and the walls of the underground were now covered with propaganda messages aimed at the civilian population. And at night it was a makeshift refuge from German bombing raids. Around the same time, Frank Pick began to experience serious health problems, and in 1940 he was forced to retire. A year later he died at his London home at the age of 63. When the war had ended, some, such as Edward Borden and Betty Swanwick, continued to create striking and aesthetically pleasing images, but without Pick at the helm, the volume and quality of posters reduced quite rapidly, and Frank Pick's People's Gallery was gone. In his role at the Underground, he had been a modern Medici, commissioning some of the best designers and illustrators of the first half of the 20th century. And luckily for us, most of these remarkable and aesthetically pleasing images can still be viewed online. You can even buy some of them from the London Transport Museum. So maybe the gallery hasn't gone, it's just moved location. Thanks as ever for watching, and more is on its way. See you then, I hope.